You find yourself standing in the cobbled marketplace of Rouen, May 30th, 1431. Dawn creeps across weathered stone while merchants arrange their stalls around a freshly built platform. The scent of baking bread mingles with something else, bundles of green wood stacked higher than a man's head, still damp with morning dew. Church bells ring the hour as a young woman in a rough linen shift is led through the crowd, her head shaved, her feet bare against the cold stones. She's 19 years old and about to die in a way that will haunt Europe for centuries. The legend tells us Joan of Arc died heroically for France, a martyr's death that inspired a nation. What the legend doesn't tell you is that her execution was deliberately designed to be the most psychologically devastating spectacle medieval cruelty could devise. This wasn't just an execution, it was a carefully orchestrated ritual of humiliation, a medical experiment in prolonged suffering, and a propaganda performance that went catastrophically wrong for everyone involved. Because here's what they don't teach in school. Joan didn't die quickly. The English authorities specifically ordered green wood to ensure she would burn slowly, and they positioned her so high on the pyre that the flames would take nearly an hour to reach her vital organs. But that's just the beginning of what really happened in Rouen's marketplace that morning. Before we examine the documented evidence of what medieval Europe was willing to do to a teenage girl who dared challenge their authority, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you hearing this story? Our community spans every corner of the globe, all connected by our shared fascination with the moments when official history crumbles under the weight of human truth. Welcome to the Cursed Chamber, where we discover that the execution of Joan of Arc wasn't just medieval brutality, it was the beta test for techniques of destroying inconvenient leaders that we're still living with today. Medieval executions were public theater designed to reinforce social order through spectacular punishment. Joan's trial appears routine at first: heresy charges, ecclesiastical court standard procedures for dealing with religious dissidents. The paperwork reads like bureaucratic efficiency, formal accusations, witness testimony, legal protocols, carefully followed. Nothing to see here, folks, just medieval justice doing its medieval thing. But lean closer and the machinery starts looking less like justice and more like choreographed revenge. The trial lasted 4 months, not because the evidence was complex, but because the English needed Joan's death to appear theologically legitimate. They couldn't just execute a prisoner of war that would be, well, a war crime by medieval standards. They needed her condemned as a witch and heretic, so her military victories could be reframed as demonic intervention. The language in the trial records gradually shifts from standard legal terminology to something far more sinister. What begins as routine questioning about religious beliefs transforms into systematic character assassination. Joan wasn't being tried for heresy. She was being systematically dehumanized, so her torture could be presented as holy duty. It's like medieval HR putting together a performance improvement plan, except the improvement they wanted was her complete destruction. Here's where we notice the first red flag: the English had already decided Joan's fate before her trial even began. Church officials were coordinating with English authorities to ensure a predetermined outcome. They weren't seeking truth, they were manufacturing consent for murder. The trial was elaborate theater designed to make the audience complicit in what everyone privately knew was political revenge. The selection of judges reveals the predetermined nature of the proceedings. Bishop Pierre Cochon, who presided over the trial, was a known English collaborator who had been driven from his own diocese by French forces. His appointment wasn't about theological expertise, it was about ensuring loyalty to English interests. The entire ecclesiastical court was staffed with men whose careers depended on pleasing their English paymasters. Medieval legal procedure required certain formalities to be observed even in rigged trials. Joan had to be given legal counsel, but her appointed defender was instructed to provide only the minimum assistance required by canon law. She had the right to appeal to the Pope, but this right was systematically undermined through procedural delays and legal technicalities. The trial followed all the proper forms while ensuring none of the protections actually functioned. Now the story gets darker. Joan's interrogators understood that breaking her spirit was more important than proving her guilt. The questioning techniques reveal a systematic campaign of psychological torture designed to shatter her sense of divine mission. Think of it as medieval gaslighting, but with eternal consequences. They forced her to wear men's clothing, then condemned her for cross-dressing. They promised her communion if she submitted, then withheld it when she complied. They brought witnesses who contradicted her testimony about her voices, then demanded she renounce the very revelations that had driven her to save France. It's psychological warfare disguised as theological inquiry. The most insidious tactic was what we might call theological gaslighting. Joan's faith was absolute. She genuinely believed God had chosen her to crown the Dauphin and drive out the English. Her interrogators systematically undermined this certainty by arguing that true saints never claimed divine communication, that humble Christians submitted to church authority, and that her military success proved she was trafficking with demons rather than angels. Picture the logic. If you're really holy, you wouldn't claim to be holy. And if God really spoke to you, you would know that God doesn't speak to people like you. Also, winning battles proves you're evil because good Christians lose gracefully. It's the kind of circular reasoning that would make a philosophy professor weep. Historical records show Joan becoming increasingly confused and desperate as the trial progressed. She began contradicting herself, agreeing to recant, then immediately reasserting her divine mission, begging for mercy, while simultaneously insisting she had done God's will. This wasn't weakness. It was the predictable result of months of sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to make her doubt her own sanity. The interrogation strategy involved creating impossible theological puzzles that would force Joan to contradict either her voice's church authority or her own previous statements. Questions were designed with no safe answers, theological traps that would ensure guilt regardless of how she responded. It's like asking someone, "Have you stopped being a heretic yet?" Either way, they're admitting to heresy. Sleep deprivation was another weapon in their arsenal. Joan was kept in chains in a cold, damp cell, awakened frequently throughout the night for emergency questioning sessions. Guards were instructed to interrupt her sleep at random intervals to prevent her from achieving the rest needed for coherent thought. This wasn't accidental cruelty, it was deliberate psychological torture designed to undermine her mental capacity. By month 3 of the trial, the English had accomplished something remarkable. They had transformed a confident military leader into a psychologically shattered teenager who could barely remember her own name. The young woman who had lifted the siege of Orleans and crowned the Dauphin at Reims was now a broken shell begging for mercy from her tormentors. Mission accomplished medieval style. But wait, there's more, and it gets considerably worse. Here's where the story takes its darkest turn, and we'll keep this YouTube friendly while acknowledging the medical horror of what happened. Medieval Europe had developed execution by burning into a precise science of prolonged suffering. The English authorities specifically ordered green wood for Joan's pyre wood that would smolder and smoke rather than burn cleanly. They wanted maximum, shall we say, processing time. And they got it. The platform was built deliberately high, placing Joan's body well above the initial flames. Contemporary accounts indicate that this positioning meant the fire would take nearly an hour to reach her vital organs. During that time, she would experience what medieval physicians called the progressive consumption, slow burning, that allowed maximum consciousness during maximum. Well, you can imagine. Let's pause here and appreciate the engineering that went into this barbarity. Someone sat down with parchment and quill and calculated optimal wood moisture content platform height and positioning angles to maximize suffering duration. Medieval Europe had weaponized interior design for torture purposes. They had turned execution into a technical discipline with professional standards and best practices. The choice of green wood wasn't random or accidental. Dry wood burns hot and fast, which would have caused relatively quick death from smoke inhalation or flame exposure. Green wood produces more smoke and burns at lower temperatures, extending the process while ensuring maximum consciousness during the ordeal. It's the difference between a quick death and prolonged torture, and the English specifically chose prolonged torture. Contemporary accounts describe Joan's final hour in clinical detail. That's almost unbearable to read. Witnesses reported that she remained conscious and speaking for most of the execution, calling on Jesus and her saints, even as the flames slowly consumed her. Several observers noted that she asked for a cross to hold and continued praying coherently, even as the fire reached her torso. But here's the detail that will stay with you. Joan's heart reportedly didn't burn. After the execution, when they sifted through the ashes to ensure nothing remained for relic hunters, officials found her heart intact among the embers. Medieval witnesses interpreted this as proof of her sanctity, but modern medical analysis suggests something far more disturbing, that she may have died from smoke inhalation just before the flames reached her heart, meaning she experienced most of her burning while still alive. Medieval physicians had apparently developed specialties we didn't know we didn't want. Medical consultation was provided to ensure optimal execution procedures, with professionals advising on techniques to maximize conscious suffering duration. The intersection of medical knowledge and deliberate cruelty reveals a level of systematic torture that goes beyond random medieval brutality. The English had turned execution into performance art, complete with medical consultation, to ensure optimal audience experience. Joan was positioned high enough for complete crowd visibility during the process, according to technical reports. Medieval event planning at its most ghoulish, with professional standards for maximizing both suffering and spectacle. The timing of the execution was also carefully calculated. It took place on a market day when the maximum number of people would be present to witness the spectacle. The English wanted as large an audience as possible to see their demonstration of power and to spread word of what happened to those who challenged English authority. So let me pause here and make sure we understand what we've uncovered in these archives. We have a 4-month psychological torture campaign designed to break a teenager's spirit. We have medical professionals optimizing execution procedures for maximum conscious suffering. We have detailed documentation treating human destruction like a technical manual. This wasn't just medieval cruelty anymore. This was systematic torture disguised as religious justice, with professional consultation and bureaucratic oversight. The English had accidentally invented modern techniques of destroying political opponents while maintaining plausible deniability. And wait until you hear how spectacularly this backfired on everyone involved. What makes Joan's execution uniquely horrifying isn't just the medieval cruelty, it's how meticulously documented everything was. The English kept detailed records because they wanted legal proof that proper procedures had been followed. These documents, preserved in French and English archives, provide an almost clinical record of systematic torture disguised as religious justice. It's like they were creating a how-to manual for future atrocities. The trial records reveal the calculated nature of Joan's psychological destruction. The questions weren't random theological inquiries, they were precisely crafted psychological weapons designed to create no-win situations. The interrogation techniques show sophisticated understanding of how to systematically break someone's mental resistance while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal procedure. The witness accounts are where this story becomes truly disturbing. Those who observed Joan during her final weeks described a young woman showing all the signs of severe psychological trauma. She experienced what contemporary observers attributed to divine or demonic intervention, but what we would now recognize as the predictable effects of systematic psychological abuse, nightmares, panic attacks, and periods of dissociation. Modern analysis of the surviving documentation reveals techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a manual on psychological torture. Sleep deprivation, social isolation, constant interrogation, theological gaslighting, and systematic undermining of the victim's sense of reality. These methods were employed with scientific precision to achieve maximum psychological destruction. The role of medical professionals in this process is particularly chilling. Contemporary physicians provided consultation not to heal or help, but to ensure Joan remained healthy enough to endure maximum suffering during her execution. Medical knowledge was weaponized to perfect the torture process, creating a collaboration between healing professions and state violence that established precedents we're still living with. English soldier accounts discovered in military records centuries later reveal the psychological impact on the executioners themselves. Several men requested transfers immediately after the execution, and records suggest multiple cases of what we would now recognize as PTSD symptoms. Even the people carrying out this atrocity were traumatized by what they had done, providing evidence of just how extreme the suffering really was. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Joan's execution was the culmination of a sophisticated propaganda campaign that had been planned for months before her capture. English authorities understood that simply killing a successful French military leader would create a martyr, so they needed to destroy her spiritual authority before destroying her body. The character assassination campaign involved techniques that remain standard in modern political warfare. They questioned her moral character, her mental stability, her social class, and her family background, anything that could undermine her claim to divine inspiration. When theological arguments failed, they resorted to attacks on her choice to wear male clothing and command soldiers weaponizing gender norms to destroy her credibility. Church authorities were persuaded that Joan represented a dangerous precedent, a peasant claiming direct divine revelation that bypassed institutional hierarchy. Her execution was meant to send a message across Christian Europe that religious authority belonged to established institutions, not charismatic individuals. It's medieval messaging about staying in your lane with eternal consequences. The international dimension of Joan's destruction reveals how institutional power protects itself across national boundaries. English authorities coordinated with church officials, foreign diplomats, and university theologians to create a broad consensus that Joan's destruction was not only justified, but necessary for maintaining social and religious order. The most revealing aspect is how quickly the English realized they had made a catastrophic mistake. Within days of the execution, reports were spreading across Europe with details that made the English look like monsters rather than liberators. The deliberately prolonged suffering, the psychological torture of the trial, the burning of a teenage peasant girl who claimed divine inspiration, it all backfired spectacularly. But the real horror was yet to come, the systematic cover-up attempts that followed. The English authorities had planned Joan's execution as the ultimate propaganda victory. By burning France's supposed savior as a witch, they would prove that French military success had been demonic illusion. English rule would be legitimized, French resistance would crumble, and the 100 Years' War would effectively end. It was supposed to be medieval shock and awe, a demonstration of English power that would terrify their enemies into submission. Instead, Joan's execution became the greatest propaganda disaster in medieval military history. Witnesses were traumatized by what they saw, including English officials who had ordered the spectacle. Contemporary accounts describe English authorities expressing immediate regret and horror at what they had done. Not exactly the response they were hoping for. The crowd's reaction was immediate and violent. Instead of accepting Joan as a condemned heretic, spectators began collecting ashes and fragments as sacred relics. English soldiers had to clear the marketplace by force to prevent the spontaneous shrine that was forming around the execution site. Within hours, they were literally fighting off pilgrims, trying to sanctify the place where they had committed what everyone recognized as an atrocity. The speed with which public opinion turned against the English is remarkable. Within days, reports of Joan's death had spread across Europe with details that made the English look like the villains in their own propaganda story. The deliberately prolonged suffering, the psychological torture, the burning of a teenage peasant girl who claimed divine inspiration, every detail that was supposed to demonstrate English righteousness, instead demonstrated English cruelty. French forces began fighting with unprecedented fury, treating every battle as revenge for their martyred saint. English military morale collapsed as soldiers began to fear they were fighting on the wrong side of a divine conflict. The psychological impact on English forces was so severe that military historians have documented widespread cases of what they call supernatural warfare syndrome, mass panic attacks triggered by the belief that dead Joan was personally haunting English armies. French commanders quickly learned to weaponize Joan's memory for military advantage. They would invoke her name before battles, display banners with her image, and tell stories of her martyrdom to inspire troops. The English had accidentally provided France with the perfect military motivator, a saint whose brutal murder could be used to justify any level of violence against English forces. The Siege of Orléans, which Joan had lifted in 1429, became the template for French military strategy throughout the 1430s. French forces fought with religious fervor that English military leaders couldn't match or counter. When your enemy believes they're fighting for a martyred saint against demon-possessed invaders, conventional military tactics become significantly less effective. The English had accidentally manufactured their own worst nightmare, a martyr whose suffering was so extreme it convinced even their own soldiers that she must have been truly holy. It's like they had created a horror movie where they were unambiguously the monsters and then had to live with the consequences of everyone recognizing them as the villains. Within months of Joan's death, English authorities began systematic attempts to suppress or reframe the documentation of her trial and execution. Official English records were edited to minimize the psychological torture aspects of Joan's trial. References to her extended interrogations were shortened, descriptions of her emotional condition were removed, and testimony about her physical suffering during execution was reduced to bureaucratic language that obscured the reality of what had happened. The most revealing cover-up attempts involved the English monarchy's later efforts to distance themselves from Joan's execution. When Joan was rehabilitated by the Catholic Church in 1456, English royal records were retroactively edited to suggest that local authorities had exceeded their orders in pursuing such harsh treatment. Suddenly, everyone was claiming they had nothing to do with the torture and execution they had meticulously documented. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows English authorities frantically trying to control the narrative about Joan's death. They sent envoys to foreign courts with revised accounts that minimized the torture aspects and emphasized the legal legitimacy of the proceedings. But the damage was already done. Europe had seen what English justice looked like, and the image was permanently burned into collective memory. By 1456, just 25 years after Joan's execution, the Catholic Church had completely reversed its position. Pope Calixtus III ordered a rehabilitation trial that systematically dismantled every aspect of the original heresy conviction. The same church that had condemned Joan as a witch now declared her a martyr and saint. It's the medieval equivalent of our bad on a cosmic scale. The rehabilitation trial records provide perhaps the most damning indictment of medieval justice ever preserved in official church documents. Witness after witness testified that Joan's original trial had been conducted through fraud, intimidation, and deliberate misinterpretation of theological law. The English authorities weren't just wrong, they had knowingly perverted religious justice for political ends. Joan's execution transformed the 100 Years' War from a dynastic dispute into a religious crusade. What had been a relatively civilized conflict between aristocratic cousins became a holy war that would reshape European politics for centuries. The English had wanted to end French resistance. Instead, they had given France a patron saint and a rallying cry that would echo through history. The long-term political consequences were devastating for English interests. French national identity crystallized around Joan's martyrdom in ways that made English occupation permanently illegitimate. The English couldn't hold territory where the population viewed them as demon-worshipping murderers of saints. Within 25 years, they had lost virtually all their French possessions except Calais. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy is how Joan's case became the template for destroying charismatic leaders who threaten established authority. The systematic use of religious authority to legitimize political violence, the weaponization of gender norms to destroy female authority figures, and the deployment of legal procedures to provide cover for predetermined outcomes. These techniques were perfected during Joan's destruction and remain standard operating procedures in contemporary political warfare. The psychological techniques used to break Joan appear in virtually every major political persecution of the past 6 centuries. Character assassination, systematic isolation, sleep deprivation, circular questioning designed to create contradictions, and the weaponization of institutional authority against individual resistance. These methods transcend historical periods because they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology. Modern democracies have inherited the precedents established during Joan's persecution. The use of legal procedures to provide cover for political revenge, the systematic character assassination of leaders who challenge established authority, and the deployment of institutional credibility to legitimize predetermined outcomes are all techniques that were perfected in medieval France and remain in use today. The intersection of medical knowledge and state violence that we see in Joan's case established precedents that continue to influence how governments approach the systematic destruction of political opponents. The collaboration between healing professions and torture apparatus, the use of scientific knowledge to perfect suffering, and the documentation of human destruction as technical procedure. These patterns appear throughout subsequent history whenever institutional power decides someone needs to be eliminated. Joan of Arc's execution wasn't just medieval cruelty, it was the beta test for modern techniques of destroying inconvenient leaders through systematic psychological torture disguised as legal procedure. The English authorities in 1431 accidentally invented the blueprint for political persecution that we're still living with today. They pioneered the art of making atrocity look like justice, and we've been perfecting their techniques ever since. The most chilling realization is that the same institutions that tortured and murdered Joan eventually canonized her, not because they recognized their error, but because public opinion forced them to rebrand their victim as their saint. It's the ultimate institutional flexibility. If you can't beat them, claim you created them. The cursed chamber of Joan's execution teaches us that the most dangerous atrocities are those that dress themselves in the language of justice, morality, and institutional authority. When powerful institutions decide someone needs to be destroyed, they don't announce their intentions. They create elaborate legal and moral frameworks that make destruction look like duty. What strikes you most about how little has changed in 6 centuries of political persecution? Do you see the same techniques being used against modern leaders who challenge established authority? Let me know in the comments which parallels between Joan's destruction and contemporary political warfare surprised you most. Remember, the past has many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and not all of them are buried as deep as the powerful would like us to believe. The techniques they perfected in Rouen's marketplace are still being deployed. Today we've just learned to make the torture more psychological and the execution more metaphorical. But the machinery of institutional destruction remains remarkably consistent across the centuries. The echo of Joan's screams still reverberates through every modern political trial where the verdict was decided before the evidence was heard, where character assassination substitutes for actual argument, and where institutional authority is weaponized to destroy those who dare to challenge the established order. We're all living in the shadow of what they learned in that cursed chamber.